because the presentation is going to be done in English. So if you need translation to Spanish, these are the indications. You can go to the interpretation button in the controls of Zoom and click on the language you would like to hear. To be able to hear the interpretation, if you want to listen in Spanish, you can press on Spanish. And we thank you all to keep your microphones off, and all the questions, you can put them in the chat. At the end, you're going to have some time for each of those questions. So the basic rules, so we are having a safe space for learning. Cameras and microphones will be deactivated throughout the whole webinar. Please write your full name, the country, and the organization you belong to. You can ask your questions on the chat or the space for questions with Zoom. And if you're on Facebook Live, you can send your questions through the comment section on Facebook. Your questions will be given to the presenter at the end of the presentation. So all that is expressed in this webinar is not responsibility of Marfund, and it does not necessarily represent Marfund's opinion. So we give you a welcome, and this is our 24th session of Marfund. We are forgetting our spawning aggregations, institutional amnesia, and changing baselines. Our presenter today is Stuart Fulton, Director of Development and Community of Biodiversity called COBI. He's co-founder of the startup Digital Services for Sustainable Fisheries, founded in 2022 to use technology called Pesca Data for fishermen and small-scale fisheries. Stuart has worked over 15 years in marine conservation and sustainable fisheries in Mexico and in Latin America, with a focus particularly on science, citizen science, and marine reserves and fish spawning aggregations. These are our channels, and we're going to share them in the chat if you have any questions.
So, yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm Stuart Fulton. I'm the Director of Development at COBI in Mexico. And this work stems from work we've done with Marfund in the Marfish project over the last couple of years. The focus is fish spawning aggregations, which we'll be talking about, but we're using that as an example to discuss both shifting baselines and this concept of institutional amnesia, which I'll get to. So yeah, I hope the presentation is interesting, and I hope it provides some reflections on other topics beyond fish spawning aggregations. So COBI, where I'm based, we work in the Pacific Gulf of California and around the Yucatan Peninsula. This year we're celebrating 25 years as an organization. I'm based in the Mexican Caribbean, where I've been working on fish spawning aggregations for a couple of years now. So this is kind of what we're going to discuss in the session. Again, I'm not going to talk loads about what fish spawning aggregations are. I think many people, seeing some of the names in the chat, many people know what they are, but hopefully we can share some good information and conclude about how we can improve our organizational management of these aspects. So as a couple of slides introduction, fish spawning aggregations are big concentrations of fish that get together for reproduction. They tend to occur at specific times, places of the year. For example, groupers tend to aggregate from over the winter months, maybe December through March, depends on the species, around the time of the full moon. And they get together at specific points where it's likely there's favorable biophysical characteristics. So certain depths, certain reef geomorphologies, possibly where two different currents are coming together, which are kind of thought to help with larval dispersal. And again, around the world, over 300 species of fish have been documented to spawn in this way. So there is a short video here. It may not play well, but there's no sound or anything. So it's just to see a spawning aggregation in action. There are different types of aggregations. There's transitory ones and resident ones. We're going to focus on the transitory spawning aggregations, where fish migrate long distances for brief spawning events, which may last for a couple of days or weeks at specific times of year. And these tend to be like the higher predators. So like top predators are higher up the food chain, often commercial species like the groupers. I mean, there's examples of Nassau groupers traveling over 200 kilometers from their home range to the spawning site. Other species, for example, surgeonfish or some of the parrotfish are maybe resident spawners, where they spawn inside their home range, and they tend to do this either year round or through specific months. So there it's we're not really focusing on those. We're focusing on the bigger fish, particularly groupers and snappers, who come together to spawn in big numbers. And why are they important? Well, they're obviously, if you're bringing together all these fish into one place, they're areas of high productivity. They have impacts on food networks. They bring huge concentrations of food resources, both the physical fish and the eggs they produce. And this means that it can attract larger predators. It can attract animals that feed on fish eggs, whether it be some fish species or all the way through to whale sharks, which have been well documented in some of the Belize spawning aggregations in the region. And obviously, having these species which are of commercial interest, having them all together in one point also has implications for fisheries, because it's a very efficient way, if you're fishing a spawning aggregation, to catch a lot of fish in a short space of time, but you're also catching them at the most critical moment in their reproductive cycle. And again, as a global picture, this data is a little dated now, but there's about half of aggregations haven't really been evaluated. Less than a third are protected, and many of the ones that are being actively monitored are declining. And that can be declining because of fishing pressure on the aggregation itself, or fishing pressure on the species across its range. And this is an example of a spawning site in Mexico, in the Siancan Reserve, where we can see different species using the reef edge as a spawning site. This is kind of a good example where we can see one of these elbows on the reef, where there's a point coming out into deeper water. These aggregations are at around about 30 meters depth. You've got different species moving along, and you've also got, in this site, this is quite a strong current running from left to right on the image, that when it gets to the point, hits another current coming down from the right-hand side, and there's lots of eddies and vortexes and things that may favor getting the fish eggs to the places where they need to be for development, whether that be in shallower areas or further along the coast. And just to again state the importance, many of us know a bigger fish produces exponentially more eggs. So having big fish in these spawning aggregations is really important, because this is an example with gray snapper, but it applies across all species really. Bigger fish equals more eggs equals much more reproductive capacity. And then, so this comes back to work we did as part of the Marfish project in 2020. Just before the pandemic kicked in, we were able to do interviews across the Mesoamerican Reef in the 4 countries to create a status report on the spawning aggregations. There's been efforts across in Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. Belize has tended to lead the way with spawning aggregations, with efforts beginning more than 20 years ago to protect the sites. So we created a status report in 2020 which also created a policy brief, and there's been workshops, and I know a lot of work in the Cayman Crown region between Belize and Guatemala. So again, these two maps are just an overview of the region, but where we have either suspected or confirmed spawning sites. There's been a couple of sites that have changed in protection status since 2020 when these maps were made. But the important is there are many of these spawning sites up and down the coast, and as you will see, many are located on either the ends of keys, on points, on geographic locations very similar across the region. And again, Belize has the most sites, of which the majority are, well, actually all are protected. Although some sites haven't had monitoring confirming spawning fish for some time. Honduras and Mexico also have a large number of sites. Guatemala not so much, but so it's a very small area in the Caribbean Sea. And then we have the depth profiles. Again, most are occurring 20 to 35 meters deep, and on these reef promontories or points. So now to go back into the main area of the talk is the concept of the shifting baseline. This was popularized by Daniel Pauli in the mid-90s, where he looked at how perceptions are changed about resources over time. And as generations pass, what you experience in your generation, you think is as normal. So if we look at the figure on the left, we have a fisher from the Gulf of California in Mexico, where in the 40s, he fished an abundant ecosystem, where his son in the 70s fishes a less abundant ecosystem, and his son in the 90s something even less. But for them, each of them, their experience is the normal, and it would be hard for the younger fisher to imagine the abundance of his grandfather's son. And this happens across fields. It's not exclusive to fisheries. And again, there's a paper there from Alfonso Aguilar from the La Wadi in Merida University, where he studied, well, he reports on the obituary of a spawning aggregation site in Mexico, in Mahahual. And this is important because, even more important, if an aggregation site is gone and the young fishers never fished it, then they may never know it existed in the first place. This site was fished for over 100 years, where fishers in the south of Mexico would catch large quantities of grouper, particularly Nassau grouper, salt it and take it to Belize in the 40s, 50s, 60s, before the aggregation disappeared in the early 2000s. And a lot of people, won't even know that it existed, because now there's nothing. So it's this forgetting over time that creates a new baseline. And then again, this doesn't just happen in fisheries. There's some examples on the right of the slide where this is happening with coral reef scientists. And again, I'll put myself into that space. I know from reading old reports that Caribbean coral covers of 40%, 50% coral cover more were present, but I've never seen it, and it's hard for me to imagine a reef that could look like that. It can happen in fisheries, both with fishers and with fishery scientists. And also the figure on the left is an example of when we talk about population changes. We see the red line is a decline in a fishery, for example, and you can get to the point where you see a 100% increase in your low levels, but it's nowhere near where it used to be. So it's positive, but it's still a slow change relative to what the population was previously. So actually, some of these quotes are in Spanish, but these historical records can be really helpful for understanding what fisheries used to be like. There's one from the 1930s there, where in the Gulf of California and Mexico, the sport fishers are talking about the huge abundances of groupers, and in the region, it's almost impossible to fish anything else even further back in the 18th century, the fishers are saying it's hard to catch fish because there's so many sharks that are eating them on the way up as they catch them. Even further back, William Dampier, who I think was a pirate, reports catching 9 or 10 Pacific Goliath groupers, which are very, very rare today. And more recently in Mexico in the 60s, this is actually from the fisheries agency saying that they could have a significant grouper fishery in the Mexican Caribbean, which is definitely not the case nowadays. And a nice photo on the right from the 20s in Belize with a huge Goliath grouper. So these historical records are really important. And we can also see these timelines. This is for the Mahahual in Mexico aggregation, almost entirely with data that was collected by Alfonso Aguilar. And we can see by the time he got to the site in the late 80s, the aggregation was already in decline. In 1989, when he published the first paper about the aggregation, but the aggregation had already been fished for over 100 years. So what he was seeing even then was very different to what it would have been like previously, when they may have been catching over 24 tons of grouper per season. And then this leads us into institutional amnesia, which is related but different, because shifting baselines are very much focused on the person, on the individual, which is like through generations, whereas institutionally, whether we're an NGO or government or a researcher, there's also a lot of knowledge that's passed through people, but stays in the institution. So this concept was introduced in 2000, where they reported on, whilst we have so much new technology for information management, and we can find information, communicate it ever faster, it focused on government was losing its memory. And this means that if organizations lose their memory, they tend to repeat the same thing over and over again, don't take advantage of previous learning experiences. And when I read these papers, it seemed very relevant to some of the replies we got as we did the surveys in the Mesoamerican Reef, which I'll get to in a second. So I published a paper on this 2 years ago now, and I can share that later. But basically what we found was, as we interviewed people who were managing spawning aggregation sites, so either government or civil society, NGOs, we did interviews across 36 spawning sites across the 4 countries. 30 of these sites were protected from fishing, and what we surprised us that was the managers themselves reported that in almost half of the cases for the species, the abundance trends were unknown. And this, why they reported unknown, kind of became part of that previous paper, because these were the sites that they managed. So why did the managers not know anything about their sites? And another example similar to the Mahahual one in Mexico is Belize, where again, one well-studied site, Key Glory, where their fishers were catching 100 tons of fish in the 60s, with a steady decline in landings before the site was protected in the early 2000s and is protected to date. The same data presented differently. You see the orange bars decreasing as catch. But again, even in the 60s, that fishery had been operating for potentially 60 years. So it might have not been the catch that was previously caught. We don't know. And then you've got the fish sighted in the blue bars, which is again going down over time in published papers. And just to focus in on the Nassau grouper, particularly in Belize, it's important to note that this site was, the fishers were catching 90 tons or 200,000 pounds of fish with this Key Glory site. Jacques Cousteau actually went to the site and made a documentary there in the 70s saying it'd be important to protect a small area. The Nassau grouper is critically endangered. But at the same time, in Belize right now, the management regulations are actually excellent. The fish have to be landed whole. They have a minimum size and maximum size. The close season is right. But it was more of a time of things were very bad when these across the region, not just in Belize, when these measures were put into place. So any recovery will take time. And if we look at the COBI plot on the right, the colorful chart, we can see the first square is in the 20s, and this over time tracks into an unsustainable fishery, which by 87 is the circle, and then by that time management measures, by the time the line starts to come down, if you can see, that's when management measures are put into place, but the population and the biomass is very low. So it is moving slowly towards improvements, but it will take a long time, which for a Nassau grouper, which reproduces slowly, is normal. This is just this is a link there. I can put it in the chat later. I won't play the video. It's a long documentary. It's on YouTube, but it's the Jacques Cousteau visit to Cape Glory in Belize. It's definitely worth a watch if you have a 45 minutes one day. I won't play it. So getting into this, what have we forgotten? And these are some of the replies we got across the region. Is like, oh, there's no data, or monitoring doesn't work. The data is not useful. I didn't know. I didn't read it. I didn't know about the report. There's another one that wasn't said. The last one is it being good for me not to know. That wasn't said, but it kind of could be implied in some places where it's better not to know what's happening at the site. Whereas in the reality, I mean, there's across the region, particularly in Belize, but across the region, there's visual data, monitoring survey data for since 2000. That's 24 years now. It's not constant. There's gaps, definitely. It's not perfect, but we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good. There's fishing data since the 60s in certain sites. We have an established monitoring protocol across the region, which is pretty well respected. There's a lot of scientific papers and gray literature. It's hard to find, but it's there. And Belize, for example, has a centralized spotting aggregation working group and database for 20 years, which on its own is an incredible achievement. So what can we do with this? One thing is probably the hardest one, is you want to retain knowledge inside institutions. And one way to do that is having long-term staff or reducing staff turnover. And this is incredibly difficult in both NGOs and governments who are generally responsible for managing these sites because of funding cycles, because of election cycles and other reasons. But that is one of the key points. And again, from an example, in Mexico, we have 2 researchers who have an incredible amount of knowledge on spawning aggregations, but it's very much concentrated in 2 people rather than necessarily the institution itself. Then we need to improve the participation of local scientific institutions, because that can help with long-term projects. Strengthen local NGOs rather than international NGOs, because they're on site permanently and don't move to other sites over time. Improve, data collection and management can always be improved. And storytelling is really important. So as staff change, as institutions change, passing on why things are done, even through a narrative way, is really important, not just through databases and reports. And these are recommendations that apply to other fields as well that have also studied this, like how to help local governments move between political changes and ensure that things don't get repeated again and again when they didn't work. And finally, these are more regional recommendations, which again can definitely be improved upon, but fish spawning aggregations are cross-boundary resources. Like a fish doesn't care whether it's in Honduras or Belize. It must be managed as such, and that means dialogue and decision-making at the regional level. Effective data management is obviously important. Monitoring is incredibly expensive and difficult, and losing data that's been collected previously due to bad management practices should be a crime. So ensuring data is well looked after because of the investment involved. I mean, it doesn't look much when it's in an Excel sheet, but it's an incredibly expensive Excel sheet that was for data was collected. So having regional collaborations and repositories is important. I know the Marfish team is working on this at the moment. Simple systematic monitoring indicators, again, really important. It doesn't need to be incredibly complex, but simple indicators over long time periods, because again, we're not going to see a large percentage change in a fish spawning aggregation abundance in a short period of time. There are species that take a long time. More simple monitoring over 10 years will be much more effective in seeing change than complicated monitoring for 2 years, because of the funding is involved as well. Again, using local knowledge with fishers, encouraging fisher participation, because the fishers are there all the time. They will be there. There's always this discussion around whether sharing information will allow fishers to discover spawning aggregation sites, but they almost always know where they are before we do as academics or researchers or NGOs. And if they're not involved, they won't buy into any kind of management approach. And then the final one is the need for adaptive management. Because there's still a lot of uncertainty around climate change. They need to be these protected areas. Again, the Mesoamerican Reef has a lot of protected areas for spawning aggregations. They need to be continually reviewed. Fish may move, we don't know. These spawning sites are linked to oceanographic processes, most likely. They may change. We don't know exactly what will happen, but management needs to be adaptive to follow any changes with warming temperatures or changes in currents, etc., etc. So that is all for the presentation. I am happy to, any questions from anyone? I think there's some in the chat, but I'll defer to Mark on how to manage it.
Okay. Gracias, Stuart. Si tenemos una pregunta y está en inglés, dice, are there any plans to create regional FSA report cards similar to HRI's very user-friendly format that could be a tool for policymakers, local managers, and fishers? La pregunta es de Michelle Scherer.
Well, the Healthy Reefs have included some of the last report cards, a bit more information on spawning aggregations. But I think I think it would be excellent to do it. I think there's always we never want to say, again, going back to my point previously, never want to say exactly where the aggregations are, because you don't want to potentially drive interest, particularly if they're more and more fish are they doing well. But I think it's an important part of the outreach of why they're important. Yeah.
Gracias, Stuart. Tal vez cabe mencionar también que se hace el reporte de estado de las agregaciones de peces y ese también se va a actualizar, ¿verdad? Y ese también da un poco más de información en los datos de las agregaciones, ¿verdad? Sí.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Sí, no sé. Bueno, aquí alguien tiene un comentario, dice, recuerden que existen medios para proteger las agregaciones reproductivas, ya sea por medio de zonas de refugio pesquero o por medio de vedas. Estas vedas de manejo pueden ser solicitadas por el sector pesquero a la autoridad. Esta la hizo Miguel Huerta de DGOPA con la pesca. Gracias, Miguel.
Miguel Ángel, sí, incluso en México la medida de refugio pesquero ha sido el más usado, ¿no? Para proteger sitios de agregación, incluso porque es más flexible y crear una área protegida es un proceso más largo que puede ser complicado.
Sí. Marcos Cerezo pregunta, ¿qué opciones y medidas recomiendas para apoyar a los pescadores cuando se crea una zona de veda? Stuart.
¿Me lo repites, por favor?
Sí, ¿qué opciones y medidas recomiendas para apoyar a los pescadores cuando se crea una zona de veda?
Es la pregunta más importante. Es que creo que depende, o sea, depende cómo es la zona, si es grande, o sea, para proteger un sitio de desove, de agregación, sobre todo, por ejemplo, con los meros, o sea, no necesitas un área grande. Puede ser un par de kilómetros cuadrados y con eso protejas el evento de desove. Si es un área más amplia, eh, pues tiene más implicaciones en la pesca por, por exclusión de la zona, ¿no? Si es una zona pequeña y eso está protegiendo el momento de desove, pues los peces que están en la zona se pueden pescar durante otras partes del año, ¿no? Por otra parte, si hubiera entre la combinación entre vedas y zonas de no pesca para agregaciones, pues se duplican un poco el manejo, ¿no? Porque con una buena veda de 2 meses de desove, en teoría no necesitarías un zona de no pesca para esa especie. La ventaja con las zonas de no pesca que se protege todo el año la zona y puede haber otras especies digo, que desoven en otras partes del año en la misma zona, que también sabemos, ¿no? En Belice creo que hay hasta 17 especies desovando en un sitio durante todo el año. Entonces, sí, eso es algo que hay que contemplar, ¿no? El tema de dar pagos directamente al sector pesquero por no pescar es complicado, muy difícil de manejar, crea expectativas a largo plazo y es difícil mantener. Por otra parte, pues sí, hay acciones alternativas o incluso si son áreas pequeñas, pues a veces no es necesario, pero depende de qué tanto el sector puede tanto ver los beneficios y también pues ver que a largo plazo les beneficia, ¿no? Pero eso sí, esto es una estrategia a largo plazo. Entonces, ahí no tengo respuesta perfecta, está caso por caso, creo.
Ujú. Gracias, Stuart. Solo para complementar lo que mencionas, también se puede decir que hay algunos de los países en el SAM que están haciendo ¿cómo se llama? Incluyendo estas zonas de reproductivas de pesca dentro de zonas de no pesca o zonas reproductivas de pesca, ¿verdad? Para poder continuar con la protección. Entonces, esa pues es una opción que se ha utilizado. Melina Soto nos hace un comentario respecto a lo que preguntaba Michelle anteriormente en cuanto a los report cards y ella dice que se han empezado a incluir datos en los report cards acerca de agregaciones de peces y están siguiendo el estado y la importancia del manejo. Y es una herramienta que es muy fácil de utilizar y muy valiosa para el manejo y para este tipo de ejemplos, ¿verdad? Muchas gracias, Melina, por el comentario. Em, Miguel Huerta nos da otra consulta. Dice, las solicitudes de zonas de refugio o vedas pueden ser tornadas directamente por las federaciones o cooperativas a la CONAPESCA, al director Edgar Admundo Lanza Sánchez, director general de la Ordenamiento Pesquero Acuícola. Esto, Miguel, ¿es en México?
Sí.
Sí, ok. Entonces, creo que para los otros países hay otras direcciones de pesca a las que también se pueden a comunicar las organizaciones o los patronatos de pesca, ¿verdad? Sí. Ok. Patricia Kramer nos hace otra consulta similar a la de Michelle y dice si hay planes para crear una forma de storytelling o contar historias de videos para ayudar a capturar este pasado. Actualmente o tal vez en el futuro de las agregaciones de peces, ¿hay algún repositorio central de videos para los 4 países? Y adicionalmente, la importancia de compartir los datos. Estoy de acuerdo con Stuart de que contar estas historias puede ser muy poderoso para la conservación, una herramienta muy poderosa. Y tal vez los pescadores, los manejadores y los investigadores deban de saberlo.
Sí, aquí sí, a cierto punto, creo que le pongo en el chat unas ligas. Well, for Patricia, sorry, there's in the chat I put some questions, sorry, some links to the Big Fish Initiative, which is more Caribbean wide, but they have some great videos on spawning aggregations, some of which are from our area. But yeah, I think it's always great to have local information, no? So to help with that narrative and storytelling, especially at long term. I mean, having internet pages and websites is yeah, is now we have the digital tools to create repositories online. I think it's a great way to help that. And the other side is sometimes there's so much information that it can be hard to find which is the most relevant, or you get swamped by reports. So that's also a challenge, no, over time. Yeah, Melina just put the Cayman Crown documentary mentioned in the chat. Definitely worth watching as well. Which has been shown over in the 4 countries, I think, over the last year. Pilot events.
Okay. Sí, ¿alguien más tiene alguna otra consulta? Ok, aquí Ana Martínez dice, ¿cuáles son los retos tecnológicos, data science, monitoring a corto y mediano plazo para conservar, difundir y aumentar el conocimiento de este tema?
I don't think there's I don't think there's too many technological challenges. I mean, speaking simply, the easiest monitoring spawning aggregations is not particularly complicated. It's expensive and challenging, but it's not particularly complicated from a visual survey point of view. Using technology like the hydrophones and acoustic monitors is helping increase networks and monitoring and data, which again is more technological. But what has been done for 20 years in the Mesoamerican reef is divers counting fish, which again has its challenges because there's elements to it it's not as easy to standardize as, say, doing a coral reef transect. But at the same time, it's also expensive, challenging, because the fish are spawning at the same time across the entire region, so you can't be more than one site at once. And for groupers, for example, it's in the worst time of year for getting out in the water. Like for COBI's example, for the last 4 years, getting in the water has been a challenge for bad weather, etc. So I think more the long term, what we need, again, because changes take time over long time periods, is having a long-term effort, maintaining that long-term effort to get these key data points, whether they be acoustic data or visual census data. But it's maintaining long-term efforts is often the financial challenge.
Ok, gracias, Stuart. Otra consulta de Julieta Álvarez dice, ¿qué áreas de oportunidad has identificado que dificulte crear una congestión entre instituciones y pescadores para tomas de medidas efectivas de conservación?
Pues creo que no es diferente para agregaciones que para otros tipos de herramientas manejo, ¿no? Creo que son los mismos puntos de resistencia. Siempre va a haber algunos pescadores que están a favor y otros que están en contra. Pero sí es muy importante, o sea, buscar la manera de tener un gran porción del sector en apoyo de la iniciativa, sí es muy importante por el tema de, o sea, por el hecho que también la vigilancia nos complica mucho en la región, o sea, no tenemos una vigilancia de manejo perfecta, siempre va a haber un elemento de pesca ilegal y eso puede generar mucho, eh, pues, entre conflicto entre el mismo sector y resistencia a implementar acciones y otros, pues si hay una pesca ilegal que no tiene consecuencia, ¿no? Y eso pasa muy seguido. Entonces, pues es diálogo, planes a largo plazo y que también desde el sector ONG, pues no sobreprometer cosas, ¿no? O sea, un refugio pesquero o un zona de no pesca, como lo queremos manejar sin manejo, pues también puede generar mucho, pues sí, consecuencia negativa con el sector. Entonces, pues son todos elementos que hay que considerar, lo mismo con la pregunta de Marco, ¿no? El principio.
Ok, gracias. Otra pregunta sería, ¿cómo podrían las direcciones de gobierno o direcciones de pesca apoyar en la protección de estas zonas?
Yo creo que pues obviamente por la parte de las herramientas de manejo tienen que estar involucrados. Y por un poco lo mismo, o sea, el tema de vigilancia, control, manejo, o sea, también nos ayuda un poco como el monitoreo. La vigilancia tampoco tiene que ser todo el año, si no si no hay peces ahí todo el año, ¿no? Dependiendo del sitio y las especies que estás protegiendo en la agregación, pero si puede concentrar y ser más eficiente con los recursos, con los pocos recursos que tenemos para vigilancia en los sitios en los sitios y fechas donde sabemos que están reproduciendo los peces, porque ahí está mejor el impacto, ¿no? O sea, si estamos llegando a los días más importantes de la reproducción, pues ahí enfocas tu programa de monitoreo y vigilancia, obviamente con los retos con los retos que hay en todo el tema. Lo mismo por el tema del clima, etcétera, ¿no? Es complicado trabajar en esas fechas. Y pues apoyar con información, apoyar con procesos administrativos, si estás en el gobierno, para apoyar a tanto difundir información como comunicar los beneficios de siendo lo que realmente son los sumederos de larvas que apoyan la pesquería. Perdón, las fuentes de larvas, perdón, fuentes de larvas. Sí. There's another question from Patricia on climate change, which I don't feel like I'm capable to answer. I'll have to read more. There is a good paper from, I think, Brad Erisman on potential changes for climate change for some of the grouper species that don't give particularly favorable outcomes, but over like 100 years or more under the climate scenarios. But it may come down to changing temperatures, changing current patterns. I mean, we have seen, if you speak to the older fishers in Mexico, they'll say that the Nassau grouper starts spawning in December. We've never seen Nassau grouper spawning in December. Our hydrophones haven't detected Nassau grouper at the spawning sites in December, but they are shifting later in the year. So we had previously pushed to change Mexico's closed season for grouper, which is currently February and March, to include December and January. But right now, the fish are moving more into the current closed season. So it seems that it's more appropriate now than perhaps it was 20 years ago. And then we could also see, we're also seeing the fish are, again, Nassau grouper for our area. We've seen that they tend to be spawning like the peak spawning activity around 6 or 7 days after the full moon. And over the last, again, with the help of the hydrophones, that's been pushed back again, maybe 10, 12 days after in some cases. So there are changes to how spawning is happening. But what happens long term, we don't know.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, everyone, for your participation and your questions. If you have any more questions, please leave them in our social media, in our web pages, and if you could please fill out the forms that we have shared in the chat. They are both in Spanish and in English. And we thank you. If you don't have any more questions, we thank you for being here.